This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome everyone to meeting 5 of the Landscapes Plan. We started this in, what was it, June? Had 4 meetings, first the intro meeting, and then we had 3 meetings where we broke into like specific topic areas, and now we're kind of presenting a wrap up on where we're going from this point forward. Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful day. Nice fall day. So again, here's the timeline, and we had set a couple of questions as the goal to address at each meeting. This meeting, we're looking at the how and the when. So how do we preserve, and when do we do it? So we'll get into and hopefully answer those questions tonight. So how did we get here? This it was born out of the comprehensive plan. So when we did the comprehensive plan, there was a chapter on resource protection. That plan was adopted in March 23, and it lays the foundation for future of the township, land use in particular, and then other initiatives are kind of spelled out in that plan as implementation items. And resource protection came out of that plan as a high priority. So one of the first things we jumped on was this landscapes plan. And where this really came out was we had where should we grow exercises. So we had maps set up and there were dots, and people had dots to put on the map of places they wanted to protect and places to improve. And that was kind of the first indicator that there were a lot of areas in the township that people were putting protection dots. So that was, again, one of the reasons we really moved this forward. The other piece was when we did in GIS, we overlay layers. So there were different resource layers that we overlaid. And one of the things that popped out at us is there are a lot of opportunities or areas where there's multiple resources overlaying. And then we started talking about how those resources relate and how they kind of create a landscape as opposed to just an individual resource. So having a historic structure and the context of agricultural fields or a natural area around a structure really is something that we wanted to focus on and look at kind of holistically as opposed to just resource specific.
So after we kind of set the framework for why we're going to look at everything in the landscape, we started our data collection process that included a lot of public engagement and then our own research. Some of the things that we talked about in the engagement process, we had the resident photo survey. David mentioned the previous public meetings answering the 4 questions: why landscapes, where are we, what are we talking about, and who should be involved. We had a number of individual topic surveys. And throughout this entire process, we talked to a number of subject matter experts. We have Jeff Marshall here, who you're all familiar with, who has been our kind of resource preservationist, really everything involved here, consultant through this process. The picture on the screen, we had our farmer agricultural panel here, and we've talked to a number of people in the field on the areas of agriculture, natural resources, and historic preservation. Here's a quick snapshot. Thank you to all of you who have participated in the photo survey. You can see here, it was really encouraging to see where some of these pictures were coming from and some of the assets that people wanted to share. We were really asking, what's special to the community, what's special to you, and to share a little bit of your story of, what you love about the township. So it was neat to see kind of the disbursement of places all throughout the township. We had the agricultural preferences survey, which was helpful. We talk about agriculture. It's a big topic. There's a lot of different aspects of that. This helps us narrow down what we're talking about, what's of interest to people, so that we can frame some of the recommendations we're making tonight. We did a couple of word cloud exercises, which are cool to see reoccurring themes and words that people think of when we talk about these different resources. You know, what are the benefits of natural resources? We're seeing a lot of things throughout that. And then another word cloud example. What does historic mean to you? It was great to see, you know, things pop up. Again, the larger the words are, the more they were used in this survey. So things like stories, heritage, community, and that really helps us understand what's important to the people of the township. And again, I mentioned some of the subject matter experts we talked to. It's been great. There's a lot of great resources. If anything, one of the key takeaways that we've gotten through this process is being able to direct our questions in the future, whether it's as we are developing some of the recommendations we're talking about tonight. We have a good list of resources of people we can talk to on how we do that, and also for our community. Through a number of the meetings we talked about, where can people go for information on you know, native plants or forestry or agriculture and local farms. So there's a lot of great resources that we've come across. And then as we talk about really what's the need preservation, Dave will talk a little bit about how we've developed as a township and where we can reserve our resources.
And so this is a map of it's a data set that's provided nationally. So it's a land cover data set. It's done with satellite imagery. And they have categories for developed and undeveloped. So we use those categories and just kind of filter out the map. And it's very apparent that the southern part of the township is developed, northern part is primarily undeveloped. And that kind of led to the question, and some of these questions were discussed at the Land Preservation Committee, which was, Diana, Monica, was that 2 years ago or a year ago? We had some meetings with that, and we were really looking at the question of what's left to preserve, because, you know, is it worth going through this effort to preserve if there's nothing to preserve? So where we're at is we're 55% developed, roughly 44% undeveloped. And the hatched lines on there are kind of the interesting point, because really that undeveloped land can either be preserved or it will be developed. So you can kind of think of those two hatches being a Pac-Man almost, of eating into that undeveloped land. And the other part is we really started to struggle with, or had a lot of questions around what is meant by preserved and what is open space. So those were questions that we find even, you know, in other communities, open space means different things to different people. So we really focused on getting into some of those definitions. So preserved land that will remain undeveloped forever, is one way to look at it. And there's typically requires a specific action or regulation to permanently protect it. And the undeveloped is another kind of tricky term, because there are instances where there's preserved developed. An example would be a historic, like King George Inn would be an example of that. So it's in a developed area, but it's could be preserved. There's also some places, and the data set that I mentioned actually refers to like sports fields as developed. So that's another kind of nuance in this whole conversation. So open space, land that's not intensely developed. So kind of that, getting back to that, if it's sports fields, is it developed or undeveloped? But I think the big thing is that it's open and there's that vista and the view that's really important. And what we're trying to do in this plan is identify specific types of open space. So that, again, this kind of gets to one thing that we learned during the comprehensive plan process was developing a common language. So we came up with place types in the comprehensive plan where everybody hopefully understood what we were talking about when we said a certain thing. So that's one of the topics that we're bringing up in this plan. So we're proposing open space designations. So a large farm, and when we had our agriculture session, we had Newhart, I forgot his first name, but Joel Newhart was here, and he farms most of the land, if not all the land in the township, for agriculture. And the large farm is typically over 10 acres. Agricultural use, often it's monoculture or wholesale crops. So soybeans, corn are the two big ones. And it's usually mechanized labor. So there's a tractor or a combine or something involved. Ownership's typically private, and the preservation method, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is typically an easement. So we're familiar with the Lehigh County Ag Program. This is really what they're targeting when they're preserving farms, is these large farms, and getting the agriculture easements on those farms. So one of the things that we discussed is small farms and farmettes. So we're looking at parcels that are 5 to 10 acres, agricultural, typically with a house on the lot. Often there's multiple crops involved, and sometimes they're wholesale, sometimes they're CSA, community supported agriculture, or go to market or restaurants. So that's kind of a larger market farm. Again, these are typically private. There are opportunities and examples out there for public small farms. The other thing with the small farm is farmettes. So that's another term that we've used, is a small farm. A lot also in this is, we call it low impact livestock. So horse farms, goats, chickens, that type of livestock. So we also have market farms, and these were brought up at the ag session by Kagan of the seed farm in Rodale. These are typically less than 5 acres, agriculture and residential. Could be done on a large lot residential, multiple crops, specialty crops, typically for market, retail, direct to consumer, or direct to restaurant. And then these typically are done hand labor or small, like a tractor, small tractor, things like that. Again, typically private. There are opportunities and examples for public ownership of this type of farm. And a preservation method is a deed restriction, is something that we can kind of keep parcels at that size. Active park, think of sports fields, Lehigh County fields, typically what we think of with active parks. So active recreation, sports fields or playgrounds are typically what we are talking about when we mention active parks. Typically those are owned publicly, and then the preservation method is usually acquisition. So somehow the township or the county acquires these properties and puts the park in. A passive park, again, areas for passive recreation. Think of walking trails, picnicking, wildlife viewing, suppose fishing falls into that. Typically public, and again, most of these we see are preserved through acquisition. So the township or the county gets the property and then opens it up for a public passive park.
And to throw in then nonprofits, speaking of my background as a land trust, this is where land trusts become involved rather than all being on the municipality's shoulder.
So then we also have, and this is one that kind of came up in discussions in the township, is our naturalized areas. So these are areas that are open space, typically left wild. Think of wildlife habitat. You not maintained. If they are maintained, it's just roadside mowing kind of thing. They usually contain some sort of natural resource. So whether it's a woodland, a riparian buffer, or a wetland. And these, a lot of times we'll get these as part of open space dedications for land development projects. So that designation of, once we get a property, what do we do with it? What category does it fall under? Is really, again, some of the impetus behind these designations. We also have stormwater management areas. Think of large detention basins. They're publicly owned or sometimes HOA owned, but it's a property or something that provides an open space. The maintenance is prescribed by best management practices, so there's regulations involved in how to maintain those specific open space areas.
And there's a new trend coming on, at least down in Bucks County where I am, is different types of way for sewage management. Not just stormwater, but fields, drain fields, spray fields. There's a lot of different venues or operations that could and will presumably in the future fall into this category that the township should think about.
Yeah, and we actually have as part of this building along Ridgeview, we have the stormwater basin, and then there's also a spray irrigation field. So those are things that are starting to come up that we'll see popping up, these spray irrigation fields. Within best management practices, there are non-structural techniques that are kind of starting to come to the forefront. Lehigh Valley has a green infrastructure handbook that talks about non-structural ways to manage stormwater. So that's something that we'll start to see more and more.
So we'll pause here to take any questions and kind of just recap how we got here. Again, the open space areas that Dave just ran through, these are the 7 sort of filters or designations that we'll be looking at as a township when we start to think about the purpose of preserving open space. Each of those might have a certain purpose. Each of those might support preservation of a specific resource, and each of those might have its own sort of management maintenance strategy. And also, as Jeff pointed out, in a lot of those areas, that's specific. Some of them are specific to township taking ownership of, and some of them might still be, preserved as private property through some of the mechanisms that we'll talk in a little bit, or working with like a land trust or a nonprofit or another partner. Are there any questions about kind of how we got here, some of the things that we mentioned before we move on? And I think I did see we do have one person online. If anyone online has any questions. Okay. Not seeing any, we'll move forward. So we talked about how we got here, and now we want to identify what are our resource opportunities. So there's really a lot here. We kind of showed the map before of kind of the overlaying resources. We have 2,300 acres of active farmland. 6,000 acres in this township are designated as prime agricultural soils, which is pretty amazing. A lot of those soils have development on them, but it just shows that, and this was certainly mentioned in our ag panel, there's good farming opportunities here. We have 800 acres of riparian areas. This includes floodplain and our stream corridors. 1,500 acres of woodlands. At the natural resource meeting, we talked about the different categories of woodlands and the importance of those, and about 1,100 acres of steep slopes. Again, these are critical, very sensitive natural resources in the township. And as far as historic resources, we currently have 4 features that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places in the township. 2 of those are covered bridges, the Dorneyville Crossroads Settlement, and the Haynes Mill. We have 5 features that are identified by the state as National Register eligible that have not gone through the process at the federal level to be listed. And throughout the past several months, we've identified over 70 additional features and sites that have some historic context to the township that we have information on that are still standing. For the most part, I believe they're all still standing that require further investigation.
Yeah, and that list may include duplicates. One of the things we're finding is, one resource may refer to a home as the Guth House or the Guth Homestead. It could be the same thing. It might not be. So we have to really kind of dig into all of those. Yes, Diane.
But I think the key in these numbers is that most of the time, these resources are identified through some planning project rather than by the individuals or the community reaching out or trying to identify what they already have. It is a reaction to some type of state or federal project.
If you could identify the 5 features that are eligible for National Registry.
I don't have it on me. I wonder, Jeff, do you know offhand? A couple of them are homes, historic homes. There may be another like Crossroads settlement, I believe. And then I know one of them was a home. It might have been like if not the Guth Homestead, one of those homesteads in that area. So what we'll talk about in a little bit is we have a good list to start with. A lot of these need further investigation, and what we've set up is kind of our inventory process of how we can categorize these and put the information in so that we have a way to inventory it, and then we'll talk about what we're proposing as kind of our next steps as a classification process.
And
if you really, the numbers again are a little bit shifting, but from the state, and we're trying to rectify, is that there are a number of things that have been declared eligible because somebody did a project, and I am not familiar with them by name, but some of them are archaeological, so that's why the number is, they have the Roots Farmstead listed 3 different times, 3 different ways, so that's why the numbers don't work. The Adam Good House, the Albright House, the Elias Guth House, the Daniel Stetler House, the Adam Good Farmstead, the Adam Good Barn. So it's hard to give you a good number, which is why.
And
Said earlier, but they're the ones that, again, through some process, they've been identified, not by a historian going out and look, but because there's something going on that the governmental rules and regulations say you have to tell us if there's something significant there.
And that's
the primary source for those 9 for us internally was our official map. So I think there were 13 on that map, and lime kilns were on there multiple times. So that was identified on the official map, and then also in the 2009 plan, they had a list. And I think it was somewhere around 9 was in that list.
Interesting side note. So as Jeff mentioned, those eligible properties have come up because there has been some sort of project happening, and then they're identified, and they're being addressed for whether it be restoration or mitigation or something like that. But there's certainly other assets in the township that we have come across through some of our, our history book that we have. I mean, just for example, the property on there, and I don't believe that's identified as one of the eligible properties, but I certainly think it could be. It's just there hasn't been anything impacting it. So it's, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of the undeveloped land. It will either be preserved or used or destroyed. So the emphasis on the importance of us sort of taking the initiative as a township and identifying these resources and their significance, and then taking action on those is critical, because a lot of this stuff we can't just wait for a federal highway project to come through and then
And conversely, some of these things that have been identified by the PHMC may no longer stand because they were identified as being eligible. They weren't mandated to be saved. And part of the process for in Pennsylvania is a developer or someone who is required to submit this does not submit it to the township. So the township could be reviewing a subdivision and land development and not know that the state historic preservation offices think it's important, because the developer doesn't have to make a triangular conversation. He deals with the state and he deals with the locals. And he will say this, often they try to keep those two apart because they don't want two regulatory agencies to get together and constrain them more than they would be otherwise. So that's an important thing that you mentioned earlier, that because they've been designated, township should be in the process aware of it and then include that in part of the review.
So we have a lot of physical assets and opportunities, but one of the things that was really great to hear in what we have in the township and what people are interested in, we have a lot of opportunities for the community. There's interest in expanding agricultural opportunities. We talked a lot about some of the things that we have besides just, saving farmland, which is the most critical and the most important that we've heard, but also the idea of, community agriculture and access to agriculture and different types of agriculture. There's certainly interest in preserving the environment and some of our natural resources, and people have been very vocal about that. And then it's amazing through the historic preservation conversations. It's not just about the physical features, it's also about the stories and the culture and the legacy and kind of preserving the heritage of this area. So there's a lot that we could do as far as fostering this kind of community engagement around preserving all these assets in what people can do here in the township. So, any questions before we move on? Yes. Would you mind actually just asking in the microphone, because we're recording?
I'm Mark Bassis, and it's funny, it's sometimes those little things that make a difference for the environment and for our homes and the community. And I live near South Whitehall Chase Park, and it's just a big open grass field, except around the retention pond, there's bushes around it, which gives it separation. So one of the neighbors wanted Herb or the township to knock all the bushes down, take it down so it would just be an open grass field, nothing other. And I was fortunate to have a relationship with Herb, and I said, Herb, that is a separation. That people walk their dogs on one side and the other side so their dogs don't attack each other. There's a fox that go, like when people go, the fox will hide on the backside of the shrubs and then come back when people leaves. And that kind of separates an open grass field and gives it at least some humanity, and some birds live in the shrubs. And Herb was good enough not to knock it down, in spite of the neighbor, someone complaining that it should be cut down because the shrubs were not pristine. And I mean, I know it's a small thing, but to me in that park, it was great because it gives me a little, it's some contrast. It's not just a big open grass field. So my hat's off to her for doing it. And it's my little world, but it meant a big difference.
So, and that kind of speaks to these open space categories that we were talking about. One of the things that we're touching on is maintenance of those open space areas. If there is a naturalized area, or we're trying to do a non-structural stormwater management technique, some people will think it's weeds and it looks like weeds, but it's really, a naturalized area, or it's intended to be left in that state. So those are some things that we're trying to bring forward with this plan and that designation. So again, if a resident calls up and calls to take down the bushes, we can point to this plan and say, that's a stormwater management area and those are there for this reason. So it's kind of trying to give, a little more structure to that relationship and how we approach different open space areas.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is also for kind of protection on the private landowner side of things too, and putting pieces in place that for a private landowner looking to preserve resources in their own backyard, that we have proper guidance, and that we also have the proper kind of I'll say the laws and the standing to allow for that to happen. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the ordinances we're proposing, but just for example, if someone wanted to kind of protect an area of a stream behind their house, well, we want to make sure it's not in conflict with our high weeds and grass ordinance, but it's actually doing something that's very functional for that natural asset. So we kind of talked about the opportunities, and now how do we address these opportunities? So we're going to talk about kind of our preservation toolbox, and I imagine we'll talk about this a lot in the coming months. We're looking at really 3 different areas of this preservation toolbox, and some of the tools within, and that's land preservation. We talked for the past several months just about how important land is. It's either going to be developed or preserved. So how do we preserve it? Asset preservation, and then outreach and education. So when we talk about land preservation, and bear with me here because we're going to get into the weeds, pun intended. We're going to look at really a couple of mechanisms to preserve land: fee simple acquisition, easement, deed restriction, and the tools we have available through zoning. So before we get into that, one of the things we wanted to kind of talk about is when we're talking about preserving land, what do we really mean when we talk about ownership of land? So property ownership can kind of be explained as a bundle of rights. You have right of possession. This is the legal authority to own the property. Right of control, the ability to use and change the property how you want, again, following local rules and regulations. Right of enjoyment, it's your property, you can enjoy it how you want, again, following local rules and regulations. Right of disposition, if it's your property and you have the rights to it, you can sell those or transfer those as you wish. And the right of exclusion, which means no trespassing private property. All property owners have that right of control. So they all have the right to develop, as our local rules and regulations allow them to. So when we look at wanting to preserve properties, we have to always remember that first and foremost, that everyone who has property rights has that right to develop. In many cases, it is a voluntary agreement to preserve that property. We'll talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that we can encourage preservation, but that's just important to keep at the forefront here. And some of these rights, as we want to work through options to preserve them, Some rights can be relinquished while others remain. And we'll talk about this as we get into things like easements and restrictions. Did you want to mention something?
I was just going to talk, you touched on it, but you had talked about like the bundle of sticks as these property rights. And when we're talking about preservation, we could be taking the right of control away, but the property owner still has all the other sticks, is one way to think of it. And we'll get into that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. So the first, we can go to the next one, sorry. The first tool is fee simple acquisition. So this is where we're talking about acquiring the entire bundle, where landowner has full ownership of the property, and then that gets transferred to someone else. In this case, the township, most likely.
I mean, the simplest way is buying and selling.
Yeah, exactly.
For the people who aren't used to the jargon.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jeff, I mean, you have years of experience in working with this and all these different property rights. So just jump in here as we kind of lay this out. So this, in my mind, is the cleanest and most effective way of controlling the property, because then all of the rights come with that one transaction. The new owner has complete control of the property. So this is, for example, the township acquires a piece of property, the Davis Smith property, for example, that was acquired a few years ago. The township owns that in fee simple. We own it, we have the rights to it, and there's no one else involved. The next mechanism is easement. So this is where we talk about that bundle of sticks, and we're really only taking one of those bundles out, or we're only taking one of those sticks out of the bundle.
I'm going to chime in again for the
Yes.
people who aren't used to this. The term is easement, which most people think of someone gets like a railway easement or a right or a utility easement. These are really restrictions. So think of wherever we use the term easement, it is a restriction. And that's, it's unfortunate that that term is used, but it is, as we said, part of the bundle of rights that you have voluntarily restricted you and future property owners from having those rights. So easement is a poor term, but that's what we use in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it gets confusing because and Jeff kind of mentioned it too. So the easement runs with the land itself. So the landowner today could own the piece of property, and the township can take an easement on that. And then that right to prevent development would stay with us as the township, as the holder of that easement. Landowner A could sell that property tomorrow, and that easement would still remain on that land. It continues to be sold, and the township always in perpetuity maintains that restriction on that property. So it's a very effective way to preserve properties without having the maintenance responsibility or the management responsibility of owning it completely. It's tricky though, because you're entering into an agreement with this landowner, the next landowner, and the next landowners forever. So there's always challenges there. There's a lot of ways that us as the township can work with this as an option, whether it's the township holding the easement directly. We had mentioned the Lehigh County Farmland Preservation Program. They work primarily with easements, so that's where the county actually takes the easement to preserve working farms. Working with land trust and other entities to actually hold the easement jointly is another way to help identify, having someone else who can be monitoring what these rights are in perpetuity. To confuse it a little bit more, we did kind of talk about the restrictive easement, but the other thing I want to mention is an affirmative easement. And I think this is important to mention in this township, where we talked about limited rights of public and private access. In some cases, we could utilize easements to allow for public access for something. So when we talk about some of the interests of the township, not necessarily for a preservation of the resource, but maybe education and outreach component of accessing a private property. So we can look at developing a public access easement with someone. We have the Jordan Creek Greenway. The township holds several public access easements for that. That's allowing public access along private property. So that's where we look at these are as affirmative easements. We're adding something which it actually takes away that restriction of no trespassing.
And trail easements are one of the prime examples of that type of easement where you go to our property owner, we want to have a trail through your property, we will pay you or whatever the process is. And so that stays with the township because you don't want when you have a trail system established, you don't want the next property owner to say, no, we don't want you on the property anymore. So it's part of what the responsibility of a good plan is to have those trail easements in place instead of having to acquire all that land and have to do everything else.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about. There's options for us to bring the public to places that may be in private ownership. I can think of maybe some of the examples of our potential historic properties that may be better rested in private ownership, but maybe allow some limited public access to that we could have through public access easements.
In case anyone's thinking, there is a body of law called rule law, which says unless you charge money, if you allow the public on your property for the recreational use of land and water act, you cannot be sued for anything that happened that is not actively your fault. Always comes up when we talk about that.
So then kind of what I look at as the next level down is a deed restriction. So this is where we're controlling one of those rights. It's not as, I'll say, in my mind, it's not as solid as an agreement as, say, a conservation easement or something like that. The property owner maintains the ownership of that property. And where we would use the deed restriction most likely is where we might have an asset on the property, or there might be an asset of interest, whether it be an historic asset. Landowner comes to the township to develop that area. We want to restrict what can happen to that historic asset. We would enter into an agreement with that landowner, and there would be a restriction placed on the deed so that nothing can alter that historic asset. But everything else about the property is under the control of that landowner.
And the key distinction between that and a conservation easement is conservation easement has a third party. The land goes between buyer and seller all the way down, but a third party, be it a township or a land trust, has the right to control it. The deed restriction is between the two parties. Mm-hmm. And who has the right of enforcement is critical. If there's a deed restriction between the two of us and we say, you can't hang your laundry out on Sunday, and I don't enforce it, you can't enforce it because it's a bilateral agreement. So that's the key difference between a deed restriction and a conservation easement.
And I'll say the least restrictive or the least enforceable, well, enforceable is the wrong word, but yes, exactly. The least permanent option is through zoning regulations. So development rights, open space requirements, these can be regulated through zoning. So in many of our districts, we regulate the size of what can be developed there, the size of a structure, what type of structure can be there. We can look at, we've talked before in the comprehensive plan about conservation-based zoning, conservation-based subdivision, and this is where we can look at requiring or incentivizing more open space preserved where development occurs in a smaller area. The other key component of this conservation-based zoning is identifying the highest resource value on the land and directing development away from the high resource value areas. So even if it's not just that cluster development, we're avoiding stream corridors, steep slopes, that sort of thing. And then The other piece of this is the transfer of development rights. So this is something we touched on a little bit in the comprehensive plan. And transfer of development rights program is where you can essentially exchange development rights in one area for preservation in another area. And we would identify areas within the township or even on a smaller level that are prime for growth, that we would want to, that it would be okay to allow either more density or higher building allowances. And in exchange, you might have areas of the township that we certainly know we want to preserve, and the private landowners could sell their rights that they have on those private lands in the conservation area to someone looking to develop in the what we'll call the redevelopment area, the area that we're looking at more density. It can be a very complicated process, but it can be a very, very effective process, especially in a township like ours where we have development interest. And if you think back to kind of the beginning of this, every landowner has the right to develop. So everyone who owns property has that right already. Not all of them may be interested in voluntary conservation. Not all of them may be interested in some of the purchasing options that we as a township could pursue with either easements or acquisitions. So this is another mechanism that we can look at.
And transfer of development rights programs can get very complicated. And oftentimes that's a downfall of them. And if we are going to propose a TDR is the acronym for that. If we were to propose one, we would have to keep it as simple as possible so that people might actually use it. And you can think of it as a way going back to that map we showed with the build out exercise, we had preserve and protect, and then we also had population and job growth. And one of the themes that came out of that is redevelopment. So a TDR program would incentivize development and redevelopment in areas that are appropriate for it, and at the same time, incentivize areas for protection. So the idea is you can kind of think of it as a conservation-based subdivision clustering almost on a township-wide scale. So you're taking development rights from a deed restriction typically, and then that creates a density bonus or some sort of bonus in the receiving area. So that's a way to encourage redevelopment. At the same time, you're encouraging preservation.
Do we want to pause there for any questions anyone might have? Anyone online?
Nope.
No? Thanks. Okay. So we talked about the different mechanisms, fee simple acquisition, conservation easement. These transactions, both of these transactions, they can be donated, they can be transferred, they can be purchased. One of the key components to a successful land preservation program is having the financing to be effective in acquiring easements if necessary, and purchasing property if necessary. And there's a lot of options out there with grants and different funding programs to help offset the cost of this. One of the mechanisms that we're proposing through here is for the township to look into actually being able to fund some of this preservation on their own in order to actually leverage some of the funding that's out there in grants that usually require a match requirement. Usually, if you can get 50% of the money from a grant, or if you can get a grant, they require you to put up 50% of township dollars towards that. So the Pennsylvania open space law authorizes local governments the right to preserve, acquire, and hold land for open space uses. We talked earlier about the different types of open space that we are looking at in the township, and that open space law also authorizes local governments the right to impose an open space tax by increasing the rate of our earned income tax. And then this must be authorized by voter referendum. So essentially, we would put a question on the ballot that asks the residents if they're in favor of increasing the earned income tax to support the preservation of open space or the purchase of open space. If that passes, then an ordinance would be passed by the township that allows for that increased rate, and that would start the funding for this preservation program. That money is set aside and it can only be used for the preservation, the acquisition of easements, rights, and property for open space, and a percentage of that can also be used for the maintenance of that open space. So there's just an example of the type of question that would be asked on the ballot there. But this is certainly a very successful tool. I know it's certainly growing in Pennsylvania. In Northampton County, there's currently 7 municipalities that have an earned income tax increase for their land preservation programs. In Lehigh County, I believe there are 3, and it's something that would be worth considering to look at really utilizing the tools in the preservation toolbox.
Before we go on, there are certain communities, at least in Bucks County, where they've literally just taken a bank loan out to buy the land, and because they have the taxing authority, they can have a scheduled repayment of that loan over a certain set amount of years. So that's not the only way. That's one of the better ways, because it's you don't have the debt. It's the whole community pitching in.
Any questions on that section?
Okay. Next, we'll talk about asset preservation. So really some of our ordinances and getting down to more the site-specific stuff. Jeff, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code and how that kind of enables us as a municipality to preserve this stuff.
Yeah, the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code, the MPC, actually states that communities shall preserve their natural and historic heritage, not may, but shall. And there are now a number of ways to do it, and historic preservation ordinances are a key way. Traditionally, historic preservation ordinances were limited to small or contiguous areas like a city or a town where there was adjacency, all the buildings were connected. The MPC was later adopted that if the township does a comprehensive inventory of its historic resources and identifies the most significant one, then the restrictions and bonuses that accrue to a property owner who has that type of resource can be anywhere in a township. And so the key, and I don't know how much we will get into it, but the historic preservation ordinances is really twofold. Is that not all old buildings are the same. Not all old buildings are historic. We in the history biz actually distinguish the term between something being historic, which is important in history, and something being historical, which relates to history. So you have a lot of historical buildings in that they're old, but determining which ones are historic through an inventory has some sort of criteria that's established going in. And the criteria typically involves 2 things. 1, what is its significance? Why is it important? And 2, what is its integrity? Does it still look like it did during its period of significance? And you have to have a balance of the 2 in order to have something considered historic. And once the township has considered historic, being on the National Register is typically one thing, being determined eligible is another thing. The third way is being identified through a comprehensive inventory by whoever the township designates to do the survey. And that then there's a list of properties that will get either special consideration in density bonuses, adaptive reuse bonuses, the hope being that it will maintain the economic viability of historic structures and really get rid of the quote need that developers say to demolish old buildings to maximize their yield on a property by saying, the term we use is free density sometimes, is that you keep that house and barn, you get to calculate your density as if they were gone, but they're still there. And that gives them free density and saves them cost of demolition. It often provides an enhancement to the community they're building. So it starts to be an economic as well as an emotional decision made by developers or property owners. So that's why they're important. The flip side to that is most preservation ordinances have a tiered series of restrictions based on the significance of the building. And the simplest one that I've seen in most communities is if you have a building that's, and typically go class 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, C. But if you have a class 1 building, National Register or eligible or found to be significant, if you apply for a demolition permit, you have to wait, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever the ordinance says, so that the property can be studied, evaluated, and perhaps salvaged. That's the simplest one. And there are different restrictions in terms of what preservation ordinances do have. But the key, I think, for public acceptance is to have as many incentives as you have restrictions. So that the property owner isn't bearing the burden of preservation for the greater community. And there are, dozens, if not 100 of these throughout the Commonwealth. They've been around since the 1970s. I just went over one in East Bradford in Chester County, which has been the leader. I think it's had about 12 revisions since 1970. So, these things get adapted and adopted, and they're very helpful. I did a lot of work in Doylestown where you can get a cluster, which the underlying zoning may not allow if you move all your buildings away from the old house. My offices was something called the Aldi Mansion in Doylestown. We had the right to use that for weddings and events in an area that wasn't zoned for it because it was designated on this list as being significant. And that was the best way to protect that resource. If you have a 100-foot barn, you better have a use for it in the future if somebody tells you got to save it. And that's, again, I don't say carrot and a stick, but it is really important that you incentivize as much as try to control property owners, how they use their preservation, how preservation occurs in the township.
So Jeff talked about the importance of kind of that identification process. We mentioned earlier that we have, roughly 70 sites or properties or assets that we have kind of looked over and kind of identified, but there's a lot more research that needs to be done. That historic resource inventory or that historic resource survey really is that mechanism to, as Jeff mentioned, get the details together, designate those properties, and start to look at what's historic and what isn't, and what that means. So we are proposing really 4 classifications of the historic assets in the community. That first class is the highest one is it's already listed on the National Historic Land as a National Historic Landmark or under the Register of Historic Places. There's a lot of benefits to this, as we've mentioned a couple times now, of that kind of pause with any federal project. That's how a lot of these we've even identified that have come to us as a township, because they have been listed as a historic place. So there's a pause, whether it's a road widening or construction or anything with federal funding. There are certain tax incentives to the private landowner for that. And just the raised level of significance. I think it means a lot if you can say your home is on the National Register of Historic Places, whether that be from you're looking to market the property, or even we'll talk a little bit about kind of the adaptive reuse and maybe some commercial aspects to that. Class 2 is properties that are National Register eligible that just haven't gone through that process yet. The hope here is that these Class 2 properties, we would be preparing the application process or working with the private landowner to prepare that application process to get them onto the National Register. Class 3 are the properties that we would designate locally as local historic resources, and this would be by township resolution. Some of the benefits that we'd propose here is unlocking adaptive reuse provisions. So as Jeff mentioned, all the examples he just said, these are things that we could incentivize to some of our historic properties. It's a way to preserve the resource on private property, and also help to sustain that property is preserved by allowing maybe commercial uses, whether it's in a residential area or not, allowing relief in certain other restrictions. And then that final class, Class 4, it's all those other listed assets. That's where our list of 70 is at right now. It's on that Class 4. We are, or maybe not even there yet.
No, yeah. So the survey would be Class 4. So if they were on the survey, our 70 list is potentially able to get to that Class 4 because we have duplicates.
And basically how it's done is you take a map like we have on the wall there and
Yeah.
you go out and you see if they're still there. You don't make any, you're not assessing whether, if you're saying it's important because Mr. Walbert built it, would Mr. Walbert recognize it where he walked down the street today? Chances are some buildings he wouldn't. And so they're on that list. But again, as I said, not all historic old buildings are the same. And it just gives you the baseline. And then from there, you make an informed decision as to which ones are worthy of preservation and which ones are, then how do you go about implementing that preservation?
So we look at this as kind of our ladder, and the hope is, the more significant they are, the higher the ladder they can climb. But it also allows for even those certain assets and properties that might not be as historically significant on a national level, they certainly are very significant to us as a municipality and to our local heritage, our local culture, that there is justification in designating those and providing some incentives to preserve those.
And this process takes a while. And when I work in other communities, I encourage them to adopt an ordinance called Historic Resource Impact Statement, so that if a developer does come in, it's up to them to go through this analysis process or pay the township's consultant to do that review. So you don't have buildings disappear over the next year or two before the survey is done. So it's a basic tool. And I keep using it for developers, and I shouldn't, but property owners who want to develop their property, whether professional or not, they're used to going through things. They have to do wetlands studies. They have to do what other studies. As long as people going in know what the rules are, they can handle it. And I think the key is that you express to the community and developers that South Whitehall has a preservation policy. That the default is we want to see it saved. The default is that you come in with a blank slate and start from scratch. And that's something this does even before all this other stuff's in place. That's important for a community to do. And that can be done relatively easily.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a great point, Jeff, because it puts it right up front with instead of us asking about something later, saying, oh, by the way, you have a house here that we've identified as it might be significant. We want to talk about it. It's right in the beginning. As soon as someone comes in, they know that we've already identified it and that we have this impact statement that we need to go through.
And if you haven't identified it, the basic question is there a building or are there structures on your property greater than, pick the number, 50 years old, 75 years, whatever it is? If the answer is yes, then you need to do this next step.
Some of the other preservation tools that we have are some of our natural features ordinances. So we already have a floodplain ordinance and a stormwater ordinance in the township, and those regulate what you can do and can't do within the floodplain. The stormwater ordinance is much larger than that, and it talks about how we're managing our stormwater. And that's also important from a developer's perspective and what's required there. Some of the other ones, riparian ordinance. Here's a good example of something, stream corridor, and making sure that we can put in the appropriate parameters to preserve the resource that's there, and ensuring that the riparian area is intact, and that can include management provisions and also preventative development provisions. Steep slope ordinance, we've talked about how important steep slopes are and how sensitive they are, and we talked about how many there are in the township. It's easy to map, it's easy to show, and we want to kind of prevent development there because of the very potential or negative impact they could have on the surrounding area. And woodlands or tree ordinances, we've talked about the importance of woodlands. We have a shade tree commission right now, and we've talked about the urban forest. We've talked about our core forest, and this would be looking at really the importance of trees in the township. And a lot of this gets put into, so with our ordinances and with all the inventories, a lot of this gets then really depicted into the township official map. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about our official map now and how we use that, and how this would be a similar sort of process?
So the official map, we currently have an official map which has 3 components. Each of those components show different aspects. The primary action or reason to put things on an official map is there's legislation and there's rules that if it shows up on an official map, the township has standing, lack of a better term, to enter into negotiations with the property owner looking to develop. So it kind of stops the clock and forces is probably not the right word, but it brings potential developer to the table to discuss whether it's a road connection is shown on the map, a trail connection, or land preservation. So it's a mechanism, very well used and recognized in the state of Pennsylvania tool in our planning toolbox that I talk about a lot. So things that we've talked about here can get incorporated into the official map to start triggering that should a development come in, it brings us to the table.
Thanks. That might be a good place to pause and see if there's any questions about the sort of asset preservation ordinance side of things. No? Great. Yes, it's on the township website. And I mean,
I don't know where, but if you search for it, you can shoot an email, and if you can't find it, let us know, and we'll get you a copy of it.
Okay. And then the kind of last piece of it is outreach and education. So we talked a lot about more of the regulatory side of things and the direct action from the township and, what municipal governments are able to do. We've learned a lot through this process about what the community is interested in, what the community wants, and now we're kind of challenging the community again to say, well, let's do this. Let's talk about preserving our resources. So kind of just a few things here. Oh, sorry. One of the things we want to talk about was history. We heard so much about the idea of preserving our history, so many ideas of how we can do that, and story sharing. And I think it was really encouraging to see how excited everybody got around this idea. One of the things we wanted to kind of talk about and and I'll kind of see if Jeff, do you want to jump in here as well? The difference between a historical society and historical commission. So these terms are often thrown out together, but they really are two different things. And the historical society is something that is really separate from government, that can be tied to government, certainly, but it's not in the sense of a historical commission. We had talked about some of our potential regulatory process and that review process and the inventorying of our assets. Those are more the jobs of a historical commission, similar to our planning commission, similar to our shade tree commission, where they're an agent of the township performing a township function. It's limited number of designated people involved and limited in the scope of what they can do following the township code. A historical society, on the other hand, is a lot more flexible. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of how they can sort of implement some of the ideas we've shared.
Yeah, and as you said, the main difference is that the Historical Commission is a body of the government. A historical society could be hosted by the township, could be hosted by a library if they needed a place, but it's private individuals who have a concern about history. And they set up bylaws and they determine what they're interested in. Some are interested in preserving local artifacts. Some are interested in preserving buildings. Some are interested in acquiring buildings. Some are interested in educational programs. So a historical society is broad, and almost every county has, a half dozen to a dozen. Mostly they're township wide. And there are a couple, the Northampton Historical Society, Lehigh County Historical Society, Bucks County Historical Society. There are bigger ones, but the ones that we're talking about are, at this point, are engaging and empowering and incentivizing or helping local people get together who have an interest in history, how to manifest that interest in some way that is for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of ways that we can kind of work with a potential historical society in kind of fostering this collaboration. We sort of talked about the idea of the preserving a property, but then also the use of that property and kind of the education around it and the events that could happen there. These would be great functions of a historical society. I know that it's something that we can certainly assist with, whether it be, providing space for meetings, or I think of, our abilities with GIS and do things that are like story mapping, which is a really great way to kind of showcase some history through time. And I know I've been talking to the Parkland Area Library about their interest in, they have a lot of community programs already and kind of fostering this idea as well. So it's something that I think is certainly needed in the township based off of what we've heard. I think there's good local examples of other historical societies that have been around for a couple decades now. The municipal historical societies that we can look to. And I think it's something that we would like to see happen, but it's certainly, there has to be the interest there of the community in order to initiate something like this.
And it's generally a 501c3 organization, so people who are interested can make donations, and then the Historical Society can, in fact, acquire artifacts if they come up for sale. They can, pay professionals to run programs. There's a lot of things that they can do that the township is not able to do as quickly or perhaps as efficiently.
Yeah, I know I've seen a lot of them grow over the years as well and kind of expand. And as you mentioned, like sometimes they might be focused on preserving a historic building and then using that building as kind of a museum and an area for events and so forth. So there's a lot of potential here for it, I believe. And it's something that we would like to see happen. The other kind of outreach and education side of things, we have the Township Environmental Advisory Council. Derek is here. Thank you from that. I know Marie and Sarah have been very involved in this plan as well. And so we're one of the things out of the comprehensive plan that we identified is the need to really invigorate the Environmental Advisory Council, get this going again. We're looking at hopefully doing that in 2024. And what we have is kind of laid out the kind of the goals of the Environmental Advisory Council. And you can see from these goals of identifying environmental problems and plans and programs, making recommendations to possible open use of open space, promoting community environmental programs, keeping an index of open space areas, advising the township in the acquisition of open space, reviewing subdivision land development plans, making recommendations. These are all things that are very critical. This body is very critical to implementing this landscapes plan and a lot of the resource preservation strategies that we've identified.
And a historic commission would be almost exactly parallel. If you look at each one of those bullets, that's what a township historic commission could do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in some communities, the two are related, that the historic commission is almost a subset of the environmental advisory council. So it's all set out. So how to do it is there, and do the same thing, review the subdivision, make recommendations. It's all pretty much the same church, different pew.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we were going with, and it kind of was born out of this landscapes plan and looking at things holistically and putting all of this into a single plan. The potential is there for this landscapes plan to be the guiding document for the Environmental Advisory Committee or Council, which could include a historic commission roles. And we have to look at structure and how to address that. But that's kind of one of the things that we started thinking pretty early on, is how this landscapes plan and looking at things holistically, and this being a guiding document for a recommending body to the board or board of commissioners or the planning commission. So there's kind of that overlap between historic commission and environmental advisory committee. And, that's really what drove us to pursue this, was all the overlap that we see between historic, natural, and agriculture.
And so one of the things that we just share here as an example is this board or this council could assist with the identification of when we have an opportunity for open space preservation, looking at what are the components of this landscapes plan, what are the agricultural components, the historic components, the environmental components, how that all works together, and kind of assessing the needs there, and demonstrating the priority and the justification for the township pursuing that acquisition. So those are kind of the draft recommendations. Really, the next steps for us would be to draft the final plan, and then this would go to the Board of Commissioners for adoption at a public meeting. And then following that adoption, we have a lot of things that we've talked about. And really, some of the priority goals here, I think some of the things that have come out of, we absolutely should consider pursuing that historic resource survey or historic resource inventory. Really is the key to get our historic assets down on paper, designated, and start to go through that classification and designation process. Along with that is the drafting of a historic preservation ordinance. We talked about a lot of the components of that, including the potential resource impact study requirements, the allowing of adaptive reuse, and what all the mechanisms to preserve the historic resource, whether that be a deed restriction component. The open space tax we mentioned, that is something that there's a lot of regulations behind the timelines associated with that. So that's something that certainly, if that's of interest, that's something that we want to look at the timelines very carefully and consider what we need to do in order to put forth a ballot referendum so that we can start that process and start to build up that the necessary funding to actually manage an open space program. And then the zoning revisions, we've talked a little bit at the Board of Commissioners meetings about what we're doing and looking at the zoning ordinance. So we're taking all of the pieces of this landscapes plan and putting that into the framework of the zoning revisions that we're looking at so that we can kind of dovetail those appropriately. If we're looking at open space preservation and some of these other ordinances, we can fit that into our zoning ordinance.
And I think the important piece to discuss is we've been lucky enough to have some Board of Commissioners here at these meetings, but the entire board is not, we have to bring the entire board up to speed in the public forum. So that's really the next few Board of Commissioner meetings. We're going to try and put this on as direction and discussion and start talking about the process and these recommendations that come out of it. Because ultimately, these decisions are Board of Commissioner decisions. So that's really the next step in this process, is to bring all of this work that we've done and input that we've gathered and bring that to the Board of Commissioners and make recommendations of possible avenues they can pursue. So that's really where this is going to be going. So you'll likely see this on Board of Commissioner agendas in the coming weeks.
Other than that, if there's any questions.
And it was a lot. I mean, there was a lot in there. Thank you for bearing with us.
You'll be quizzed on property rights.
Any questions or comments or?
If not, thank you all very much. Olivia, did you have a question or?
We have a historic, it's a use in the use schedules. So I forget what the exact title of it is, but if you go to our use schedules, there's historic resource, and that's what we've used when working with the King George Inn. It was developed as part of that process. It's a piece of it. Yes, it would be updated.
Yeah, that's in place now.
Yes,
And it
Yeah.
is updated and expanded, I think would be proper.
expanded would be
Way
the
to say it.
proper.
Yeah, I think the goal with the historic or the historic preservation ordinance that we're talking about tonight is to, we talked about it being across the whole township. It doesn't have to be, site specific, and making sure it's easy for people to understand what the benefits are, and for us to understand that it's not just maybe one resource, that we have these resources, excuse me, identified already, and there's a process to go through in understanding, their level of significance and their and what that unlocks.
Yeah, the key is that it's not arbitrary and capricious, to use that jargon. Somebody has done an analysis, and that by some measure that everyone agrees upon, they are important to the community. And then you balance importance to the community with private property rights, and then you go from there.
Yeah, we want to be very proactive in understanding what our historic resources are and how we deal with these, so that when stuff like that comes up, when there is a development or someone of interest in preservation, we can say, here's the process and here's how it's handled. But I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, all of you for participating in the past meetings. I think everyone has participated in one way or another. We greatly appreciate it. This plan is for you as a residents. It's, I think we all kind of love this subject matter, and we can sit here and do it. And we're just grateful that it's appreciated. And we thank you for your participation in all of this. Thanks.
I guess I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
Yeah.